The topic of the panel is the next moves of radical Islam, and I thought when I saw that, well, I'm not much for predicting the future. So when it comes to detailing the next moves of the jihadists, I can't say what they're going to do in particular, but I can tell you what they are doing overall, what they are working toward, and why. And above all, the fact that this is something that they consider to be a 1,400-year-old struggle, that they're not going to give up lightly or easily or anytime soon. They consider that they are the sons and heirs of mujahideen, warriors of jihad throughout the centuries. And they are willing to take a few setbacks here and there. They are willing to negotiate and to arrive at treaties, at settlements, but they are never willing ultimately to see those treaties or settlements or even setbacks and losses as being definitive and final. They are only a stopping point on the way to the larger goal. And the goal is one, therefore, I think that we all need to be very well aware of. Now, President Bush has said that the jihadists are hoping to establish a unified Islamic state stretching from Spain to Indonesia. He could have added in the Americas too, of course, because their goal is global. It's interesting to note that when this comes up, this caliphate that they want to establish from Spain to Indonesia and all around the world, it is usually dismissed. And Reuters recently ran a story about how silly this all is and why we really don't need to be concerned about this at all. To show you how important Reuters thought this was, they ran this story in their Oddly Enough series, which you may be familiar with. It usually features stories about man-eating chickens and jello wrestling and things like that. And they quoted a Saudi analyst and an anthropologist in London who dismissed the idea of the caliphate as not being a serious threat and saying this is all just part of Al-Qaeda's war of slogans. The Islamic world will never unify, and therefore anybody who is concerned about this is really misplaced in his concern. Now, of course, none of that really follows from the premises. It's true the Islamic world almost certainly will never unify. It's true that their goal is absolutely unattainable. It is also true that they're perfectly willing and indeed eager to kill in order to advance that goal. And so it's something that, it's just like saying, well, Adolf Hitler will never establish a 1,000-year Reich, therefore we don't need to pay any attention to him. It's just as silly as that. To dismiss the caliphate also as just part of Al-Qaeda's war of slogans fails to note how potent slogans can be in formulating public opinion. But if you consider just how much use, for example, the PLO and the Palestinian Authority and Hamas and Islamic Jihad have made of slogans like occupation, apartheid, even the word Palestinian itself. All this testifies to how effective slogans can be. So the idea of the caliphate is something that needs to be explored in order to understand the next moves of radical Islam, because they are all oriented toward attaining this goal. Now, what is a caliphate? Of course, the caliph was the successor of Muhammad as the leader of the Islamic State for Sunni Muslims. The Shiites have a very different idea altogether, but that's another story. The caliph was for Sunni Muslims the military, political, and spiritual leader of the ummah, of the Islamic community, worldwide. Oftentimes this was more symbolic than actual in history. However, the great Islamic empires of the Middle Ages, the Abbasids, the Umayyads, they were all caliphates. The Ottomans also were ruled by the caliph. But in 1924, the newly established secular government of Turkey abolished the caliphate, and this is what is considered to be, if you read jihadist literature today, the source of all their troubles. It was as if an army had gone into the Vatican and forced the Pope to abdicate, and there was no more papacy. And the shockwaves of the abolition of the caliphate are very much with us today. As a matter of fact, one could date the entire modern resurgence, the entire modern jihad movement, to reaction to the abolition of the caliphate. 1924, the caliphate is abolished. 1928, the Muslim Brotherhood is founded. And the Muslim Brotherhood, of course, is the forefather of Al-Qaeda and Hamas and many others. And it is a direct reassertion of the political Islam that was threatened by the abolition of the caliphate. As a matter of fact, of course, Kemal Ataturk abolished the caliphate in order to defang political Islam. But I'll give you something from the Turkish branch of Hizb ut-Tahrir, which is an international political party banned in many countries, perfectly legal in England, whose stated goal is reviving the caliphate, the Khilafah. And it said, it was a day like this 79 years ago, this is a few years back, and more specifically on the 3rd of March 1924, that the criminal English agent, Mustafa Kemal, the so-called Ataturk, announced that the Grand National Assembly of Turkey had agreed to destroy the Khilafah and establish a secular, irreligious Turkish republic. Since that day, the Islamic Ummah has lived a life full of calamities. She was broken up into small mini-states, controlled by the enemies of Islam in every respect. The Muslims were oppressed and became the object of the Kuffar's derision. That's the unbelievers. In Kashmir, Philippines, Thailand, Chechnya, Iraq, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Afghanistan, Palestine, and other lands belonging to the Muslims. Without the Khilafah, the Islamic lands will remain torn up and the Islamic peoples will remain divided. So the first thing they want to do, of course, is restore the unity that was lost. But there's something else also. In Islamic law, jihad warfare may be defensive or offensive. Jihad is ordinarily an obligation on the entire community, an obligation that if one group is discharging, the others are freed from it. However, if an Islamic land is attacked, then jihad becomes fard ayn, which is an obligation on every individual believer. And this is what also, if you read jihadist literature today, you will see them saying. Jihad is an obligation on every individual believer because an Islamic land has been attacked. However, it is more, there's more to it than that jihad remains an individual obligation, a community obligation, and only becomes an individual obligation if a Muslim land is attacked. Offensive jihad, according to traditional Islamic law, jihad warfare that is actively, avowedly, and unapologetically offensive in order to spread the rule of Islamic law into a non-Muslim territory, that can only be called by the caliph. So defensive jihad is the only jihad that can be waged today because there's no caliphate. So the whole idea here is that they want to restore the caliphate because otherwise they cannot carry through what they're doing now to its logical conclusion, which is to unify the Islamic world, but not just to unify the Islamic world, but also to expand the Islamic world at the expense of the Dar al-Harb, the house of war, which is the non-Muslim world. But only the caliph has the authority to set this in motion. Now, there is already a caliph, and that is Mullah Omar. You remember the one-eyed fellow in Afghanistan. In 1996, in Kandahar, he went to the shrine of the respectable cloak of Muhammad, the Prophet, and wrapped himself in the cloak. Thereby was proclaimed Amir al-Mu'mineen, the leader of the believers. Only a jihadist group in Algeria, the Salafist group for preaching in combat, has endorsed him as caliph outside of Afghanistan. But that is one small example of the need that they feel to do this, and the desire to restore the caliphate being emblematic of the expansionist, imperialist, totalitarian, globalist aims of the jihad movement, even today as it presents itself as a defensive action against Western evils. I think this is a crucial point for us to understand in order to formulate policy properly. Thank you.